Hello and good afternoon to today's webinar, along with myself, Paul Thurston and Carsten Sorenson, where today's subject will be why are crypto assets and blockchains relevant for the business education. Today's speaker, Dr. Carsten Sorenson, is a reader, associate professor in digital innovation within the Department of Management at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Carsten has researched digital innovation since the 1980s. His research includes innovating the digital enterprise through mobile technology and the innovation dynamics of mobile infrastructures and platforms. He has developed LSE's first online crypto asset and blockchain course and has published widely within the information systems arena since 1989. He has been engaged in assisting and assessing digital startups for a number of years and has been actively engaged in academic consultation in executive education for 25 years. So I'll pass over to Carsten, where he can present his presentation.
Thank you ever so much, Paul. Thank you ever so much to whoever is out there in the webinar sphere. It's a pleasure to spend time virtually with you today. My aim is for this to last 35 minutes to give time for questions that will be passed through Paul, but we'll see. It's a relatively new presentation. If you want to hit me up on LinkedIn or any other social media, please feel free. I am not picky. I will say yes to anyone because it's very nice to have a rich network of people who are all, I'm sure, very interesting. So my day job is to study what happens when train lines are not physical but digital, and so I've spent many years studying this in the context of digital infrastructures, studying all these new fancy digital platforms, in particular the innovation platforms like Apple's App Store, and generally studying digital transformation. And as Paul mentioned, I was the lead for developing with Enrico Rossi a cryptocurrency and disruption online certificate course that has been run once so far. We get fairly good success, and we'll hopefully run it soon again. I'm also mentioning a report I helped Gowling, a law firm, make on the future business models. I'm just a little warning, it's just speculation, so nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. So we've been creatively thinking about what might happen, and you're more than welcome to download the report if you find this kind of thing of interest. So, and all the references to these papers here are at the end of the slide. So there's lots of material at the end I won't go through in detail, but you can access later when Paul will make the slides available to you. So the first interesting thing here is, you know, we all know lots of things happening on the internet. Here's a picture of what happens in a typical internet minute. And I always ask business executives I teach if anybody has a Twitch account, and nobody knows what it is except those that have teenage children. Some of you might have Twitch accounts, but of course, this is the feeding ground for the biggest YouTube stars. And one of the key things about this phenomena is exactly that all of these are digital platforms. So why is that interesting? Well, the digital platforms are interesting because they, with the advent of internet on the smartphones, we suddenly had a convergence between this open, relatively loosely regulated internet galaxy in the top, with this fairly regulated established industries in the galaxy represented in the bottom, namely financial services, telecoms, and all sorts of content providers of movies, music, or television and books. And this created quite a lot of disturbance. And these digital platforms, the way to understand them is that they've really taken the internet protocol and they've created a little fence around this, and with commanding large installed bases of users, they have been able to create a system where they take a platform tax. So in Apple's case, it's 30% of sales of the apps on its App Store. So the internet protocol has allowed these platforms to emerge simply because this innovation infrastructure is extremely flexible. And this, I have to acknowledge, this slide I have sort of borrowed from Steve Ballmer, the former Microsoft CEO, when he came to visit us here at the LSE. And then I've improved it a little bit, I hope, because I've added the labels on the right side. And And the idea is, of course, that with this open internet, you make Siri, and then when people call Siri, an audio file goes via internet, the open internet, to a cloud service that then try and work out what you are talking about and send some form of semantics back to you. And this kind of arrangement is creating a flurry of innovation that allows these platforms to happen. And the main reason for that is really, when we look at it from the point of view of, you can say, the industry verticals, that in, for example, the existing telecoms world, you would have a tight coupling between the form and function of this Nokia telephone. So the only real debacle when these phones ruled the world was really whether it should say Nokia or Vodafone when you started it up, or it should say Vodafone and then Nokia. So these guys had lots of discussions on this, but what you used it for was pretty simple. You could call somebody, that's why the numbers are the biggest. Then you can also text somebody, that's why there's text done with predictive texting, T9000. And you could play Snake, which was sort of stretching this little device to its absolute maximum. Now, this was in the context, these services were in the context of an industry vertical where the services, the hardware and the infrastructure were organized like plates in a cupboard, but they were nicely stacked, and any level would mainly compete with others at the same level. But what happened once Steve Jobs, he had produced the iPhone single-handedly, and then the Google phone, the Android phone came along, is really you had the phone separated form and function. So you could make it look like anything. It didn't have to have a keyboard. And Steve Ballmer, from the slide before, he famously laughed on camera at the iPhone that nobody would ever want to pay so much for it because it didn't have a keyboard. So you couldn't email very well on it. Now, this turned out to be wrong in hindsight, but it's an easy mistake to make. But the underlying really interesting thing here is this hourglass architecture of the internet. That the internet is really any service on any infrastructure as long as it goes through an agnostic center point, which is the internet protocol. And that allows everything to change very rapidly as long as it adheres to this one little constraint. And of course, the one constraint is then the real big problem. So here's Vint Cerf. He wants you to use IP version 6 because that's much better than IP version 4, but that has turned out to be fiendishly difficult across the globe. And I couldn't help myself putting in a picture where I had dinner with him at a Google event many years, but that's just name dropping and maybe photobombing. The point here is that this infrastructure has created as something absolutely amazing. And we need to look at what the advantages are and what the disadvantages are. And that's the main, I think, the main entry point for the discussion of blockchain. So what these digital platforms have managed to do, they managed to push human effort to the edges. So it's either low paid or it's amateurs doing the work. So we are our own IT managers of our own phones. But the price we pay is, of course, that the data of transactions belong to these platforms, because the internet is not easy to use if you want to exchange something that has value in exchange. So if you want to exchange something that has value, the internet is not very good. It's very good at making valuable things keep their value in use, like a digitized movie or some downloaded music that is ripped off somebody's CD, but is really bad of making these things keeping their value. So the digital platforms, they emerged on the open internet as a way of managing this problem. If we want to exchange things that has a value, so we buy something on Amazon, Amazon is the digital platform that allows this to happen in an extremely effective manner without the things we exchange losing their value in exchange. But the underlying infrastructure is free. So for all of these digital platforms, they rely on an infrastructure that's paid by everyone. We just then pay with our privacy. And this is where blockchain comes in. So Satoshi's dream. So the group of people or individual, we don't really know. The rumors are that CIA knows, I don't know. But Satoshi Nakamoto was the highlight of many years of development in the cipher freak community and amongst libertarians who wanted to be able to exchange things of value digitally, anonymously. And the main thing here is really that the internet is really poor at this because there was no decentralized way of doing it. So the only way to exchange things of value, as I said before, was by giving up your right to privacy. And so how do we explain this? Well, we can look at the tweet from Vint Cerf in the top right left-hand corner now that he works for Google, so maybe he has a vested interest in not believing in blockchain, but I think it's a very nice slide because generally, for most things, unless you really need privacy amongst many parties, then you generally, the blockchain is a very complex solution and more often than not, a very slow one. Now, the whole way of understanding the blockchain is really to look at basically a row of shopping trolleys connected with these keys and coins. Because the whole point is each blockchain is autarkic. It's its own little world. And you need exchanges to connect them to each other. And in order to understand what this is, we're going to look at a little bit more detail of the mechanics very briefly, and then we're going to sort of relate it to more of the integral parts of the blockchain that makes it interesting and what really makes a blockchain a blockchain. And I've put in here the Libra project or consortium that was launched last month, just a couple of weeks ago, by Facebook and other big companies and smaller companies, which is an extremely interesting development for many reasons, even if it's not necessarily ones you might think. Also, just to highlight that people have generally talked about blockchain through Bitcoin, because the payment system Satoshi Nakamoto launched with the white paper in 2008 led to the launch of the Bitcoin blockchain. And there are only two really well-functioning blockchains with more than 1 million users, and that's Bitcoin and Ethereum. And so the idea was to make a system that would compete with the global financial system. That hasn't happened, and one of the reasons is that it's really complicated to do. It takes a lot of clicks, and it's really only for the ones who are insisting. In the same way as loading an app on a smartphone with a Nokia Series 60 phone was really only for people who either had a computer science PhD or just couldn't help themselves do it because it was really hard. And of course, one of the key things about the Facebook Libra, if it ever launches really properly, it could commodify blockchain or cryptography to the big masses, which is interesting. I think if you have the discussions on Bitcoin, then the ideas about Bitcoin ranges from people who think it's the best thing since sliced bread, and to Charlie Munger from Hathaway Fund, who said it's worse than rat poison. So for my money, anything that makes people express so different opinions is worthy a look, at least. So that just as a very brief blockchain 101. So really, it's just think of it as an elaborate way of replicating databases in a manner that all the blocks, all the data points in the database are linked to each other, like these shopping trolleys. And this is done in a blockchain, and you can think of it, the effect of that, you can think of this as the domino bricks shown here as well, that if anybody after data has been secured start fiddling with the data, then it'll tipple all the blocks from there on forward in time will topple, because they are intrinsically linked to each other. Now, it is not so that this cannot be subverted. There are all sorts of issues, and I won't have time to get into all of this, but generally think of blockchains in two varieties. The ones that are based on an openness that allow anybody to run and validate the blockchain and help add stuff to it, and that's called a proof of work. This is Bitcoin and Ethereum. This, you solve a puzzle, and whatever computer solves the puzzle will get a little amount of crypto coins. And the other way is proof of stake, which is basically the owners of the nodes of the system that runs this distributed database on their computer system, that they will vote according to how many stakes they have. And then there are lots of other proof of methods, but I'll leave that for the geeks, and you can go on Reddit threads and on Telegram, and you can see lots of discussions, because essentially these are the two main ways. And of course, what this can solve is what's called the double spending problem. The fact that if you have a £100 note or a £50 note, you give it to somebody, you can't claim ownership of it subsequently. And this is very difficult in a digital context. And that's why what all these distributed databases, they all agree on, they keep the same copy of the database, and every time a transaction is accepted, it will be stored in all of these databases. And that means that everybody has the same view of who has this particular £100 or £50 note. I must admit, I don't even know whether there are £100 notes. I'm a poor academic, so I see at most £20 notes in my life. So the way to understand this is really, what is it a blockchain does? And we'll take here the example of a Bitcoin, but it doesn't matter whether it is a cryptocurrency or a digitization of some asset, or whether it is just some token that you invent between you in your neighborhood to share babysitting duties. So whenever you babysit for some other family, they give you a coin. When you have them babysit for you, you give them one of your coins. So the idea is to keep track of an equality by some measure between each peer, each party. So each computer, each person that has a computer running the full node of a blockchain will be equal in the sense that they will all have equal access to see what happens, and to be able to anonymously or pseudonymously, hiding behind some sort of address, but maybe known to some other entity, in exchanging here. So what we've suggested is a very simple framework that has a coin infrastructure and community, or coin architecture community. So you have a coin, which is a digital representation of a scarce right, of a digital right. And it could be a bond, it could be a token that has some extrinsic value, or as in Bitcoin, just an intrinsic value of people believing that it has this value. But that is then embedded in an infrastructure. So it is closely linked to this way of saving who has got what token or what coin right now. But what's most important, and what most people tend to forget, is that this is also very closely related to a social community of some sorts. That there's always a social community that's responsible for deciding what is equality in this category. What kind of cryptographic mechanism are we going to use in order to ensure privacy or anonymity in this context? They're also responsible for designing what is the consensus mechanism for solving the double spending problem. So how do we agree on exactly whether this is a correct transaction, or what is the true story going on? And the point is here, we now see the same distinction as I had in one of the previous slides between platforms and infrastructures. So if we take Barron's old article from '64, categorizing in centralized, decentralized, and distributed systems, then a lot of the discussions on blockchain arrangements focuses on the fact that these are fully distributed arrangements. So for everybody running the Bitcoin blockchain, they are all equal, and not even under one God, they're all equal. And that means if they all run the blockchain, they all have access to transacting anonymously or pseudonymously in the case of Bitcoin with each other. The point is there, you don't want to run a Bitcoin blockchain necessarily. You might want to engage with it, but you don't want to run the megabyte after megabyte that constantly updates as blocks are added. Because these days you can't even make money from mining it unless you go in a mining pool, or unless you have a lot of computers connected. So you might want to run it through what's called a light node, as we see in the bottom left-hand side. So light node is really where you rely on a wallet provider or a crypto exchange, for example, to run this for you. And so they run the node, and then you just access through some sort of website or through some sort of USB device or other means, some sort of mobile phone app. And that means that you already in any kind of blockchain arrangement normally will also have this distinction between somebody producing a service, here crypto kittens or crypto kitties, so somebody produces a D app, a distributed app, and they do that on a platform which is very similar to other kinds of traditional platforms, but they might be able to handle the privacy issue a little bit better. And they do so on top of some underlying infrastructure, for example, Ethereum blockchain, or Microsoft has just announced they will do privacy on the Bitcoin blockchain. So this is really important to just to note that when people make noises in the public press about distributed systems, then it often will at best be decentralized systems. And then people argue, so why have a blockchain instead of a centralized database? And there, the key thing is that what the blockchain platform can organize is a different way of doing privacy. Or in the perhaps also in the case of, for example, Filecoin, that is like an Airbnb for your hard disk, you are able to use a highly distributed network of people's own extra storage space on their computers as an Amazon Web Services, without Amazon or Google or others being able to know what you transact or having access to it. And you might even be able to do that cheaper, because if it's an Airbnb for hard disks, well, people make a little money from extra space, but they might not have to run a business from it. So it's like a crowdsourcing resourcing. So one of the common ways of understanding this is really to distinguish between whether you have anonymity in the validation, so whether it's private or public validation, and on the other dimension, whether you have permissionless blockchains where you basically engage any validator, or whether you want permissioned blockchains where it's only those who have special invitations that are allowed to run the full node and validate this blockchain. So if you take like Bitcoin and Ethereum and these cryptocurrencies, they tend to be permissionless and public blockchains, and they validate new blocks. So whenever a batch of transactions reach a certain size, they will be validated as a new block, and whoever resolves this cryptographic puzzle will be allowed to validate, and as a result, the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, will release in, I think it's 12.5 Bitcoin right now. It used to be 25, it used to be 50. It'll be half of 12.5 in a couple of years. So this is a way of making Bitcoin through Bitcoin mining. There's no Bitcoin mining in permissioned private blockchain necessarily. This is really that there is some payment structure between validators, but the main idea is that you rely on a trusted group of entities to help jointly validate. So Libra and Ripple is this one, although we are not quite sure how Libra is going to fall out. It's quite interesting, and I haven't had enough time to dig into it, but it will feature in a future paper that I'm beginning to co-author with Enrico. So watch this space. So people who really believe in this new distributed future, they're basically arguing that we have Web 2.0 with APIs and platforms, but we need a Web 3.0 where we have a stack of decentralized layers, and this is just one I borrowed from one of the observers in this, and it just shows like once this stack has been built up, then the open internet can be sort of have on top of that this layer of a distributed machine, a distributed abstracted stack that allows you to very quickly develop these distributed apps, and that allows you to deal with the exchange of rights or value in a way that can preserve, for example, anonymity. So what's this all about then? Well, thinking about the impact, in particular for teaching, why should we be interested? Well, on the one hand, if you look at the US, there was a special report in the Financial Times about how increasingly business schools are offering courses in this because the kids want this apparently. So this is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, that the Alphaville blog post, Jemima Kelly, she wrote about the London School of Cryptonomics because of the course Enrico and I developed with a bunch of other experts, that this was terrible, and how could this place of Bertrand Russell and John F. Kennedy and Frederick Hayek do all of this, and I had to have some serious discussions with my colleagues about this. But the point is, we somehow have heard the story before. So what I would like to do is to contrast it, because I'm old. So I was around the first time around when Web 1.0. And so the early internet, even before the web, was all about how this new internet would produce this fantastic space where all the online hippies could dance around and talk about peace, love, and herbal tea. And there was no end to how fantastic that was. And we studied that through 5 years in what was called the Internet Project, and it was very interesting. And of course, what happened was this highly decentralized world where anybody could do anything, where initially a law firm in Los Angeles got flamed incessantly because they sent an email out to people saying, we have legal services offering you. And so you were not allowed any commercial activity. Of course, it became much interesting when you had commercial activity. And that led to what now is a highly centralized internet. And I would recommend you, if you want to have a few sleepless nights, you should read a very interesting book by Shoshana Zuboff called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And she goes properly in detail about what we're doing to ourselves and our privacy. We are sleepwalking into a pollution of our brains. And she is not pulling her punches, and rightfully so, to balance this discussion where everything that has to do with these platforms is only good. Now, the point is, of course, that the reason we are not regulating these platforms is because the politicians do not have all of us constituents knocking their doors down saying that they would want these regulated. We generally like these services, but there is definitely a trade-off between our privacy and using these kind of centralized platforms. But the point is here, what was touted as this big consumer-to-consumer or business-to-consumer world ended up in a very effective way of delivering really highly complex personalized services through self-service to consumers. But on the way, it had to go over a B2B. The business-to-business success were the first ones by far. And the problem we had then is that the way to deal with the problem that information wants to be free is promiscuous. That means we cannot exchange anything except through platforms unless we want it to lose its value in exchange. And so it turned out that this notion of distribution and decentralization, it was not what it looked to be in the beginning. It's a complex and emerging story. Yeah, and it still is. Should we break up the platforms? Some people have argued that Facebook only launched Libra in order to have something to sacrifice instead of breaking up Facebook. But this is all conspiracy theories. So the new decentralization story is, well, I bought Bitcoin in 2013 and I sold them again straight after, and I'm not bitter. Who cares? But the hippie days of the crypto world was the cyber punks and cypher freaks and the libertarians thought we're going to build a new world order of decentralized value exchange, and this is really interesting. But so far the C2C impact, that C2C impact has failed to emerge. Although this is the only success so far we have of this technology. And mind us, we need to think that we have only really thought about blockchain properly in a corporate context the last 4 years. So this is important. But this idea of building in an infrastructure that tie rights and value to the infrastructure is very interesting. Also because it has built-in legacy. So all the innovation we saw on the internet will be different and possibly more precarious on blockchains, because they cannot just simply change as fast, because what's in the center is not an agnostic protocol to churn data into packets that can be sent around the internet. No, the intrinsic part in the version of IP in the blockchain is some intrinsic notion of value that is agreed by a social community. And so it's still a very complex emerging story, and the main reason for that is really that decentralization and distribution is really not what it looked like. So we could easily imagine that you could end up with just as centralized platforms here. At the same time as, of course, a lot of the blockchain use cases that are being touted is really things where you could just as well use a centralized database rather than a distributed ledger or even a blockchain. So what's important for us to understand is that the study of the internet has more or less happened within silos. So media scholars, in digital innovation scholars, other scholars, legal cyber law scholars, and each can look at it from their own perspective. Studying the blockchain and teaching blockchain is problematic because it brings together the coin, which has notions of currencies, of social, economic, and legal dimensions, with the technological dimensions on cryptography and can it be broken, can it not, with platformization of all the wallet companies, the exchanges, the fact that proof of stake is in effect a consortium, organizational theory there, at the same time as it is all agreed by a community, which means that the ethical dimension is extremely important, the political dimension. And if we look at all the existing blockchain projects for corporate blockchains that we have looked at, they tend to fail at one important hurdle, namely in the formation of sustainable groups of organizations who are then willing to jump in together, holding hand and jumping into the cold water all together. So to teach this is really about bringing together different multi or cross-disciplinary communities to help understand this. One aspect will simply not do it, which means the traditional university or business school approach is in trouble, because we all need to work together, and that's really hard to do because we each come with our own ontologies and epistemologies. So the point here is that if we look at this from sort of a more high-level perspective, then you could say, well, maybe the C2C is the only viable use case now. And then people have switched in what was sort of the first of the cryptocurrency cold periods or winters, if you want, where the price went down. Then everybody shifted to talk about B2B, to corporate using blockchains to enable sort of less need for trust in engagements. But the most interesting things are those that go in between, and that's why Libra came up. I've had this slide for quite a while, and then Libra came up, and this is exactly the point of it. It is, at the same time, you can look at it as a B2B settlement mechanism, but also a C2C, people sending WhatsApp messages to each other containing money or containing value, which is very, very interesting. So I think the middle space is where to look for the most interesting innovations. So just to finish off here, I'm going slightly over time, and I apologize for rambling on, but bear with me. So in a very simple way of explaining this in terms of the evolution of organizations, you could say the organizations initially, they needed to be big to get investments to cover large spaces because they were distributed like oil companies and train companies. So in order to be big, when it's expensive to communicate, you have to be centralized. So they became centralized pyramids that then didn't meet increasingly market demands for flexibility, timeliness, cost reduction. So what did they do? They had internal markets, they outsourced. All of this led to greater flexibility, but it was nothing compared to what these digital platforms in the bottom left-hand corner can do for you. They can outcompete, they can eat any company as long as they have an installed base that can orchestrate work between people. And it's a really very, very strong model. But if we do not want to pay with our privacy, and if we want an even more flexible exchange of value, you can imagine global networks of people collaborating in trustless arrangements where you really just use some sort of blockchain to encase what the decisions are and what you did and what other people did and who get paid what. And that could result in something even more distributed where we do not need the big central platform. So I think that's an interesting discussion. And I would argue that the report I helped Gowling write is really these business models are really ones that try and understand the relationship between platforms and blockchain arrangements and new technologies. So I'd recommend you to read that if you want to know more. Yeah, so now it's time for those of you who are not particularly keen on just lots and lots of extra reading, but to understand these things, you'd have to read books or listen to them on Audible. So if you're not interested, just lean back and think of some questions. All the references for the most obvious stuff I've written on this are here. You can find them. I will share the slides after the presentation. All academic work is all about collaborators. So these are sort of the main collaborators for the last many years of my studies of this. And I want to acknowledge all of those for all the good ideas that I could ride along with. If you want to know about digital platforms, there's a couple of books I want to recommend. The first two, The Matchmakers and The Business of Platforms, which is a brand new one. I recommend all the other ones as well, but I would recommend them from left to right. If you want to know about blockchain, again, the easiest to read is Don Tapscott and his son Alex's book, but it's also in many ways the least theoretical. But there are lots of books on this, and the definitive book has not been written yet. If you want to know about corporate blockchains, I would recommend Mary Lassiter's book, which is only about that with lots of rich cases. Privacy, if you want to have one sleepless night, you should read Harari's book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, or indeed his other two books as well, highly recommended. If you want to be sleepless for a week and read 600 pages, then you should read Shoshana's book, which is absolutely excellent, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. You will not be left with any doubt once you're done with that. But there are increasing number of books on surveillance, privacy, all of these things. If you want to know more about infrastructure, which is generally quite boring study that now is of vital interest, then there's a list of books here. If you want to know who I am, there's some PhD students I've supervised, there's some projects I've had. It is not interesting, but if you have that inclination, and there's just some of the work I've done for a number of companies on the future of work and on innovation and on these kinds of issues. We also have a website with some old videos. They're from 2012 now, but they might be interesting. There's some London sightseeing plus a little bit theory on platforms. And 2 minutes and 53 seconds late. I'm thanking you for what I assume is your patience. I have no idea what goes on where you are, but at least you could have gone through a bit of email while listening to me. Thank you.
Excellent, Carsten. That was brilliant. Personally, I found that very informative. So we've had a few questions which have come in. So the first question is, with so many different currencies being created all the time, how can we tell which is reliable and how to measure the reliability, let alone incorporate this measurement into a program?
Yeah, there is no way you can do that. There's no. It's even so bad. Well, there are ways you can do it. I'm being flippant now, but the point is there. If you look at, so I'm not an expert on money. First of all, I'm not a monetary expert. We have global experts on that here at the LSE, and they can speak for that. But generally, the idea is, of course, that a banknote is really just a right to reclaim something from the Bank of England that is then distributed to private banks. And so it has, in that sense, no intrinsic value other than we all believe in the Bank of England, because if we didn't, we would run the banks down and take our money out and put them into gold. And that's what happens when things get shaky. People buy gold and other valuables. And that's, of course, why some people argue why people now buy Bitcoin, why Bitcoin is up. I don't know, but some people argue that is really because we have a crisis coming and people are going into an investment that is not aligned with the established banking system. But the point is there, if you look at it, Bitcoin is either going to be really, really valuable or completely without any value. I don't see any middle ground there, because if this picks up, then either it will be the only original digital gold we have, so that might be a really important thing, or it'll be the MySpace of crypto. It'll be the MySpace of blockchain arrangements. That it was the first one and everybody used it, and then when Facebook came along, yeah, it turned out we wanted Facebook, not MySpace. Now, one of the key things that's important that we talk about in the course I've made, it is actually that you need to, if you want to think about these things, you need to do something that is not traditionally what you would do. Now, it's obviously, if you want to value a stock or something, you look at who's offering this, what are they doing, what are the fundamentals here, what am I buying a right to own part of as an asset. When you look at a crypto asset, of course you need to look at who's offering this. Does it make sense? What is the use case of this? And then what people, of course, often do is that they look at the GitHub commits. They look at the developer teams, because this is really about how active are they in doing what they're doing. But generally, the whole point of it is, this is the paradox of it is so easy to make money once you have, because it's open source. So you can clone any of these protocols and you can make your own, and you can even make one that's equivalent to Ethereum. So there's no limits. So and that's, of course, that means that there's also some potential for making a huge windfall when things you bet on, they go up. But the point is there. For full disclosure, I don't own any cryptocurrency anymore, because this is an interesting phenomenon. But for me, I don't want to spend my life thinking about whether things go up and down. And it is really, you could say, mostly gambling, because it's so new. And that's why you could say people's interest is as an investment object. So it's speculating in something that can have huge fluctuations. But you cannot, because it's so easy to make. It's so easy. This is one. I have here in front of me a book that I like very much, Jonathan Citrain's book. It was on one of my slides, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. This is the problem of internet innovation, and cryptocurrencies are internet innovations. It's very easy to clone a coin, and the Dogecoin that I was on several of my slides, or Dogecoin or Dogecoin, however you want to pronounce it, the guy made it just to prove that this was completely stupid, and it became worth more than $1.5 billion, I think, dollars. But it was to prove that this was stupid. And then, so the point is, the value is in the installed base of people who hold it and who are maybe even more interesting, willing to transact it.
Excellent. So we have another question. How do you view the teaching of threats associated with cryptocurrencies being taught or incorporated into curriculum? And what are the key threats currently?
This is a long, of course, the point is, if you are going to aspire to what I hope everyone aspires to, namely critical thinking, there is no way you should be uncritical to this. You should be highly critical. First of all, you should be critical to the simple fact that this is just a technology that doesn't do anything in itself. Most technologies shuttle problems from one place to under some carpet somewhere or behind the door. No technology itself will fundamentally solve problems. The point is that there is a number of threats. So the whole point is, a blockchain is not tamper-proof. So in our course, follow our course is my suggestion. We have a whole module only on regulation and risks. And so, but some of the key things are, people pretend often that these blockchains, the cryptographic hash function, is completely impenetrable. It isn't. It's just we just haven't found the hack yet for the really hard ones, like the SHA-256 in Bitcoin. But the point is, there's no guarantee we can't find it, and if we are not careful, quantum computing could one day, in the not so far future, find a way of completely making these unstable. And actually, if you look at the risk, there has been severe operational risks already to the smaller cryptocurrencies, because once price on Bitcoin went really low recently, it went really, really low on all these altcoins, all these spin-offs from the Bitcoin protocol. And once you have a very small amount of miners, the Bitcoin miners that validate additions to the blockchain, then you potentially have a a very small computer power relatively needed to be mounted in order to defraud the process and rewrite the blockchain. Sorry, I'm just getting some tea. So the point is that it is called a 51% attack. So if you can gather all your friends who also are Bitcoin miners, and you can have 51% of the mining power on a particular coin, then you can write the rules. You can write history. You can rewrite history, and you can decide to use. And some people had estimated about $200 million have been stolen from these. On Bitcoin, it's not really possible because there's so many people running the node that you can't get 50% mining power. On a more macro level, so of course, so the risks are on a micro level, which is you individually. And there, what's really important is the fact that you are not operating a full node. So when you buy and sell Bitcoin or Ether, you are not doing it from within as a peer. You're doing it through a wallet. So the most common risks are that somebody finds a vulnerability in a platform or in an exchange, in a wallet company, and there, because they have them in what's called a hot wallet, they'll steal the coins. It's much less likely once it's on the blockchain and you're operating on the full node. It's most of the time when the money is situated, when the tokens are situated somewhere outside in a platform. So that's the micro risk that somebody steals your. If you take a picture of the private key and put it on Facebook saying, "Hey, I just bought a Bitcoin," yeah, it'll be gone in 5 minutes. The meta risks is really this organizational risk and the 51% attack. But of course, the most important things are the macro risks. So the key macro risk that the Libra consortium is facing is they will be faced with a massive barrage of regulation or even banning. So the whole idea of a Zimbabwe without a stable currency, all people suddenly fleeing to use Libra instead, which means it will completely undermine the local currency. All these unstable states would very likely ban these currencies. But even, I mean, the French central bank was the first, Banque de France was the first one to say, you think you're going to be allowed to do this here? No way. And this is, of course, because as long as we only hide in uncertainty in buying gold, as long as we buy Bitcoin instead of gold or invest in it, it's a relatively little systemic risk as far as I've understood on the whole system. But once we start getting our salary in Libra and spending it in Libra, then it's a central bank issue, and then it's a monetary stability issue, and then that will be a massive issue and a massive risk to stability. And you could argue from an ethical point of view, we have now privatized our private lives. All our data belongs to mostly American platform companies. Is that fair? I don't think so, but I still use them. But do I think that money should be a private enterprise? Should Facebook own money? Should Libra own money? I don't think either. So this is a very complex discussion where I'm hardly equipped to answer it. But this is the challenge we have from an educational point of view. We need to be critical. At the same time as we don't just stick our heads in the sand and say, this is not interesting, it's just rat poison.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. What are the main steps and key points to follow or think about when getting into blockchains and cryptocurrencies?
Yeah. Do you really want to do it? That's the first one. Do you really want to do it? Yeah. So I've heard stories of people who remortgaged their house, thought they were really clever. They were very clever and lost a lot. That's why I'm not doing it. So the point is there, if you want to get into that, the first thing to think about is whether you can afford it. But I don't want to give investment advice. I mean, this is not my job. I'm a digital innovation expert. I'm not an investment expert. You should talk to people who are experts in investment. Go and talk to my colleagues in the Department of Finance. They can tell you a lot about that. So, but I would say the most important thing is to learn the mechanics. Learn the mechanics of this arrangement, because it is very complicated. Like to register, to get your wallet, to exchange, to start spending it on something or selling it again, it's like about 31 clicks or so by last count. So it's by no means no means an ordinary experience. And there are lots of examples of people being defrauded, where people make a transaction, and the whole point of it is the Bitcoin. If you read Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, the Bitcoin payment system was set up so you didn't have the middleman problem, that if you pay somebody with a Visa card, if you buy a trip with a Visa card as a credit card, and that person you buy the trip from goes bankrupt, you get your money back. And this is fantastic. The system of the Bitcoin system was set up so you couldn't do this. A word is a word. You have transacted that money. It only comes back if the receiver voluntarily gives it back to you. So to understand the basics of it is really important, to understand what is there, and then learn the differences between cold and hot wallets, because you really want your crypto tokens to be in cold wallets as much as possible, because then they can't be stolen unless, I mean, there's a famous story about a guy from, I don't know, Coventry, I can't even remember, it's in our course, and he was mining from a laptop or stationary computer many years ago. Actually, it must have been from a desktop, and he threw away the computer, but he didn't think about it because Bitcoin was just some fun. He was a computer nerd, and now it's in a landfill somewhere worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and he's trying to negotiate with the council of sharing. But the point is that if you throw away your USB key or the paper with the handwriting of the key, which is the representation of the value, then it's lost. So you need to understand this. This is really the first thing, and then you need to think about whether you want to invest in this. But I don't want to give investment advice. I'll get in so much trouble from everyone because I'm not qualified. Yeah. Don't go on Facebook. Don't go on Facebook and YouTube and see videos of people who make it look so easy and make it look like they know what they're talking about. All these curves that go up and down, they can be, I'm sure they think they know what they talk about, and I'm sure they might even know what they talk about. But the point is, it's so erratic now because it is really uncorrelated to lots of things. So we have no idea what the price changes will be on Bitcoin, for example.
Perfect. So I just wanted to get your opinion, because recently I was at a conference where they were talking about blockchain and cryptocurrencies and how it affected smaller businesses and all the hype around it not being trustworthy and it's on the downhill. Where do you think blockchain and cryptocurrencies will be in the next 5 years?
Yes. And so I will again, Steve Ballmer, he laughed at the iPhone. We only now know this because the iPhone saved the company that was bankrupt to being the first $1 trillion company. So the only thing you can say is if people say they know what's going to happen, they're almost certainly lying, because you don't. And that includes the report I wrote where we just paint out some business models. I think so Garrett Heilman, who just spoke for a bunch of executives visiting LSE these 3 days, he is extremely clever and one of the most knowledgeable persons on this. And he had a fantastic argument, because he said, well, you need to find use cases that are new, because to establish a blockchain between companies where there already are working practices, all attempts on that so far has failed. So there are no good examples, even when the use case really makes a lot of sense. But he says, if you can find something where there's a massive asymmetric risk, then that's something. So he mentioned 2 cases I think that's very interesting. One is a case of the British Food Standards Agency that he's working with, trying to understand how you can spend a few £100,000 a year on establishing a blockchain that sort of tries to secure that when people claim the provenance of some piece of meat from a particular cow and a particular tag on an ear of a cow, then that is encased in that blockchain. Then everybody can go and see it later, and that might help people not fib about the information. Now the point is there, blockchains, it's like any IT system, garbage in is garbage out. So the point is there that when it comes to Bitcoin or any other digitally native asset, then it's very different, because these are born digital. So then you can keep track of them. They don't have a physical world equivalent. But things that have a physical world equivalence that you then digitize as an asset inside the blockchain, that's a different kettle of fish. There's a British journalist who managed to get on an art blockchain that he had painted the Mona Lisa. Clearly, he didn't paint the Mona Lisa, but it was because the checks and balances of onboarding of data. So you can say once the data is on the platform, on the blockchain, it's reasonably secure, but to get there, we need to have that in place. But the point is there, if you have something like the Food Standards Agency, where the mad cow disease has cost a lot of money to this country, and if there was a way of avoiding that by securing that we know the path from calf to burger, then food contamination and all of these things may be easier to avoid. Then it's a very small cost for a massive potential gain. And the other example Garrick mentioned was, of course, voting, elections. So you could say for a relatively modest outlay, we might be able to have a process by which you have voter ID, which is your private key. And then you can go and check after an election whether your key has been registered right, whether the votes have been tallied up correctly, because you can go in and see yours. And nobody can see who you are because it's an anonymous key that only you know, the private key for. So there are lots of use cases, but the point is there, when I studied the early web days, we had no idea what the use cases would be. Now, you know, this idea of Airbnb, how fantastic, you know, it's amazing. Nobody has thought of it then. So most of the interesting innovations, they come when we use this plastic material to mold something we couldn't think of before. When I joined Twitter, I thought it's the worst thing I've ever tried. And I still have a Twitter account I don't use very much. But it's like, lots of other people think it's fantastic. I've heard the American president these days are keen on this thing as well. But the point is there, when you looked at it initially, you said, why on earth would we want to do this? And therefore, I think the most important use cases are the ones that are grounded in really important problems between people or between companies, where you want to exchange value, but you don't want to give away the data about this exchange to some third party that will then have a power over this arrangement. And there are overwhelming reasons not to use blockchains, but there might be some really good ones to do.
Okay, perfect. So I'd just like to thank you again, Carsten, for a fantastic webinar today, and thank our audience for joining us. So the slides and the audio will be available from next week onwards. So you'll receive an email from us with a link to access this. So I'd just like to thank you again, Carsten, and everyone who joined us.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.